1944. After a long hiatus, I am back. Well, it was only a week, but I'm back. This Academy Award win pretty much rounds out the wartime cartoon era. Oh sure, war's going to go on for another year, but this is, for many, the last time that wartime cartoons truly got to shine. But, let's just jump right into the ceremony. The winner of this year's Best Short Subject in Animation ceremony is a Tom and Jerry cartoon, Mouse Trouble, widely considered to be Hanna-Barbera's Tom and Jerry at its finest. Tom reads a How to Catch Mice book in order to catch Jerry, but usually, thanks to Jerry, they all fail. All the suggestions in the book fail. Aside from being really hilarious, the only thing to really note is that this is where the "Don't you believe it" scene comes from. With this being their second Academy Award win in a row and having been nominated for two others, Tom and Jerry pretty much had become MGM's mascot against all odds. Hanna-Barbera took something so cliche and managed to delve into it such that it became a thing on its own. But really, there's nothing interesting about Mouse Trouble besides that, so what about the runner-ups? We got 6 of them, maybe there's something unique or interesting with them. So let's move to the runner-ups. Second place, And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street, a puppet tune by George Powell for Paramount. The second of 2 Dr. Seuss books to be nominated. The second of 2 Dr. Seuss books to be made into puppet tunes. And both of them, this one and the 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins, each got an Academy Award nomination coincidentally. This book is important too, as it was actually the first children's book that Dr. Seuss ever wrote, and it immediately goes right into its signature style, and it's pretty much an autobiography of the man himself, albeit with a few twists and turns. Yes, I know this book is not in print because of the stereotypes. Not in print anymore because of all the stereotypes, chiefly towards Asian people. But it is a very important book, and I think it deserves to be remembered, as much as Dr. Seuss saw it on Mulberry Street. This isn't the first time that Dr. Seuss's books were adapted to animation, though. His very first book to be adapted to animation was Horton Hatches the Egg, where it appeared in 1942 as a Merry Melodies by Bob Clampett. Though it was well received, Dr. Seuss hated it and didn't do any more besides these. If it was not for the success of How the Grinch Stole Christmas, there wouldn't be any more animated stuff based on Dr. Seuss. But the Grinch's success meant that we got 14 years from 1966 to 1982 of former Warner Brothers alumni, chiefly Chuck Jones and Chris Freeling, adapting his stories to television specials, or sometimes being completely original and with Seuss's output. Even after Warner stopped, these specials continued well into the 90s, and there are several TV shows and movies based on them to this day. Oh, but back to Paramount. By this point, Paramount had relocated their 2D animation division, Famous Studios, back to New York this year. And with that, a lot of the Fleischer talent that was left out after they moved to Miami came back to the studio, including Olive Oyl's voice actor, Mae Questel. Now, you might think that this might have benefited the studio, but unfortunately it didn't. And Paramount would not be nominated for another cartoon in their own homegrown 2D animation division ever again, though they still won time to time. I'll get to that much later. In third place, How to Play Football. Although Goofy is no stranger to the Academy Awards ceremonies, this is his first solo cartoon to make it, directed by Jack Kinney. It's a bunch of Goofies playing football while a lemony narrator comments over it. So Goofy's short series can be divided into 3 distinct phases. The first is his very brief, stereotypical Disney phase in which it was just a funny animal character getting into unique situations. But these didn't really last long, because in 1938, Pinto Colvig left Disney and wouldn't return until 1944. The fact that the imitators were all seen as pale compared to Colvig didn't help. So Walt Disney got an idea, and this is where the second phase came in. Goofy would be largely silent, and the voices would instead come from a narrator who was explaining how to do various sports and/or activities and/or jobs with Goofy in the role. Goofy being Goofy, he bungles it up tremendously. One of these cartoons, The Art of Skiing, introduced Goofy's Yahoo! Holler. And because Colvig was not at the studio, it was actually done by one of the replacement actors. Yes, that's right, Pinto Colvig did not do the infamous Goofy Holler. At least initially. Now, Colvig returned to the studio, as I said before, in 1944, this year. But this particular brand of shorts was so popular that they continued regardless. Though we still got regular shorts with Goofy every now and then. There was a particular sub-series of the how-to shorts in which all of the characters in the film were Goofy. And we're not just talking, it would just center on Goofy and solely Goofy. We were talking about everything Goofy interacted with was another version of him. In the sense that we were all Goofy. So that's actually pretty nice. Fourth place, Fish Fry. And here we say hello to Andy Panda. So Andy Panda was basically the first actual breakout star from the studio that wasn't already established. It helped that Oswald was retired by this point. Initially, his cartoons were cutesy fluff. However, Alex Lovey then decided to move him to a more urban setting and make it more gag-oriented. Okay, we're getting better, but he was still very much a bland everyman. And then we got to James Culhane and his tenure out of the studio. Shamus Culhane was a Fleischer and Disney veteran who also worked at a few other places, even Warner Brothers. And he came to the studio in 1943 to replace the outgoing Alex Lovey. Culhane's tenor here is perhaps the single most important thing that he has ever done. And Andy Panda was the first recurring character that he dealt with. So, Culhane didn't exactly replace Alex Lovey. He really replaced Emery Hawkins, Ben Hardaway, and Milt Schaffer. But they had so few cartoons to the point it didn't matter. And Culhane immediately decided that he was going to give Walter Lantz a voice. The animation got a lot more cleaned up, and he started taking influence from Russian avant-garde films and live-action cinematography, making his cartoons stand out amongst the rest. His biggest success is Woody Woodpecker. In addition to refining his design, and giving him a proper voice in none other than storyman Ben Hardaway, the lead storyman by this point. His cartoons were considered to be the utmost peak. He also gave Woody a distinct personality from the rest of his screwball brethren by making him a jerk. A gluttonous jerk, to be precise. Woody's motivation was either food or somebody getting in his way. That was it. But these cartoons gave the series a considerable boost in quality, and this commenced no further than Shamus Culhane's first film with Woody Woodpecker, The Barber of Seville. Number 44 on the 50 greatest cartoons, and generally considered to be Woody Woodpecker's best short. It is, as its title suggests, Culhane's take on a particular part of the opera of the same name. And it is funny. Culhane's tenure was very brief, however, and it only lasted 2 years. And that might have to do with his tenure on Andy Panda. Now, Andy Panda, he wasn't really fond of. He just dealt with him because because he was one of Walter Lance's recurring stars. So Fish Fry was directed by Ben Hardaway and Milt Schaffer, animated by Emery Hawkins and Laverne Harding. Hawkins was one of the many people Shamus Culhane hired fresh from the Disney studio. And he is widely considered to be one of the best animators from the golden age of animation. And he was one of the most prolific to boot, working in nearly every studio during this time. So the plot of Fish Fry is Andy Panda buys a goldfish and a cat tries to steal it from him. You could tell that Culhane wasn't really that fond of Andy Panda because the film barely centers on him. Instead, it focuses more on the screwball cat and the equally screwball fish he tries and fails to eat, with the comedy around Andy being instead how the cat just royally screws him out of everything. It was his next film, however, that Culhane really had his biggest failure. After Fish Fry came The Painter and the Pointer, in which Andy Panda decides to paint a picture of his dog, but some bugs and Milo's goose get in the way. For this film, Culhane decided to bring onto Andy what he had done to Woody, give him a complete redesign, and make him a jerk through and through. Unfortunately, where it worked with Woody, because he was a screwball character and it made sense in a way, it didn't work really much with Andy Panda, who was a generic nice guy who was getting into wacky situations. So The Painter and the Pointer flopped, and Culhane, realizing that he couldn't really apply that to one of Lance's star characters, left the studio, and the torch was passed to another one of Culhane's disciples, Dick Lundy. But we'll get to that later. This was the only time James Culhane ever made it to the Academy Awards, by the way. He then left to do strictly commercial work before suddenly returning in 1966 to head the dying Paramount Cartoon Studio. It didn't last long, and aside from freelance, he retired again before dying in 1996. I will admit, however, his era, besides that cartoon, his era is a fan favorite. And I really like him too. I think that his and Dick Lundy's tenor is considered peak Walter Lantz and peak Universal. Oh yeah, to give credit where it's due, Art Heineman and Philip DeGard did the layouts and backgrounds, and they cleaned up his design nicely. And they cleaned up the design in Lance's cartoons nicely. In fact, both Emery Hawkins and Art Heineman are responsible for streamlining Woody's design into what it is today. Here's another oddity. Here's another only. 5th place, Swooner Crooner from the Warner Brothers studio. Though not their first Academy Award nomination, it is their first Academy Award nomination to be a Looney Tune, with all the other Academy Award nominations prior to this being Merry Melodies. It was directed by Frank Tashlin from a story by Warren Foster, animated mostly by George Canada, scored by Carl Stalling, and featuring voices from Mel Blanc, of course. Here, Porky is on a farm, and he has to deal with chickens imitating popular crooners of the day, wooing away those chickens. So Porky has to find a way to take advantage of it. This wound up being the only Porky Pig cartoon to make it to the Academy Awards. Porky was the original star character, though of course with Bosco and Buddy, not the original main character, but he was the first of these to break out. He initially was a sidekick to Beans, but mishandling of Beans meant Porky was to take over. The pig had a distinct speech impediment that made him stand out amongst the competition, and it really helped with the zany cartoon humor. Initially, he was a child, but of course later cartoons evolved him into an adult. Despite his popularity, Porky Pig wasn't doing well in the face of Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny, and his output became less and less frequent until finally in 1951 it was decided that his solo series would be retired and he'd be paired mostly with Daffy from then on. So, the story here was by Warren Foster, who was Bob Clampett's top gag man, and now is also you think with a hiatus this would never happen again, but anyhow, this was the only Porky Pig cartoon to make it to the Academy Award nomination ceremony for Best Animated Short Subject, and it was the only Frank Tashlin cartoon to do such. Franklin Tashlin, also known as Tish Tashlin, was pretty much the studio's Renaissance man. Getting his start at Van Buren in the early 30s, he moved to Warner Brothers briefly as an animator, before doing several odd jobs. Well, what made a Renaissance man, you ask? Well, a Renaissance man is a man who can do everything, is a man who can do a lot of things at once, and he was. And Tashlin was. In addition to being an animator, he was also a magazine strip artist and a live-action film director, as well as a children's literature maker. In 1938, Tashlin went to Disney, where he spent his longest consecutive tenure at a studio. This coming after he returned to Warner Brothers in 1936 as a director and stayed there up until then. It was here that, as director, Frank Tashlin found his voice. He would actually incorporate live-action techniques and camera angles into animated films, something that was unheard of at the time, and something really only Culhane experimented with, like the aforementioned James Culhane. Tashlin's stay as director was short-lived, however, and after he moved to Disney, his unit pretty much was taken over by Chuck Jones. Most of this unit up and left for the Fleischer Studios, that just recently opened in Miami. But after the Disney strike, Tashlin decided to take an offer to head Screen Gems. Hoo boy! And he brought several Disney talent over to Screen Gems. And this period is widely considered to be the peak of Columbia cartoons. Chiefly because he wasn't restrained anymore. Unfortunately, it only lasted a year. And Tashlin was brought back to Warner Brothers in 1942. where he would remain until 1944, but his cartoons would be pumped. But his cartoons weren't fully out there until 1946. As it turns out, that Frank Tashlin actually had a desire to do live-action film more than animation, and so he decided to retire from animation permanently and spend the rest of his career doing live-action films for competitor Paramount. Now, he could have fallen into obscurity, but many of his films, such as The Girl Can't Help It and Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter, are widely considered to be very, very popular and very, very acclaimed. He was the master of comedy, and being a cartoon director only helped this. Oh, and here is something actually very hilarious, by the way. So one of the first things that Frank Tashlin did was, as head of Screen Gems, was fire Arthur Davis, a Screen Gems mainstay, and Davis moved to Warner Brothers. A year later, Tashlin found himself out of Columbia and also into Warner Brothers, where one of the animators in his unit was none other than Arthur Davis. Yeah, the man he fired, he then went to the place the fire went to, and it turned out that he was one of his subordinates. Tashlin would himself be replaced by Bob McKimson, while in an even more hilarious coincidence, Davis would actually replace Bob Clampett, but retain most of Tashlin's unit after he decided to do a switch in crew with McKimson. I'll get to that later. I'll expand on that later, though. A lot of things coming later, folks. Speaking of Columbia, in 6th place we have Dog, Cat, and Canary, a color rhapsody by Columbia. Directed by Howard Swift, yet another prolific director for Screen Gems during this time, for the story by Grant Simmons, better known as an animator for MGM and later his own co-owned company, animated by Jim Armstrong and Disney veteran Roland Jones, and produced by Hugh McCollum, who had succeeded Dave Fleischer by this point, with music by Eddie Kilfeather. It's about a black cat who spots a yellow canary and has to defend himself from a dog. Where have I seen this before? Well, actually, this cartoon predates Sylvester and Tweety and their pairing by quite some time. So you can't really call this a ripoff. Yes, Columbia, the chief ripoff of Warner Brothers, was actually ahead of their game here. And this cartoon was popular enough that it spawned a series of sequels. The bird was named Flippy, the cat was called Floppy, and the dog was called Sam. And it wasn't until after Sylvester and Tweety debuted were they seen as ripoffs, and that was about the time they were retired, but these were basically Sylvester and Tweety before Sylvester and Tweety. It's not just a Sylvester and Tweety cartoon sent to the wrong studio. It was the original bird, cat, and maybe dog group. And now, in last place, Terry Tunes. My Boy Johnny. It's here we say hello to Eddie Donnelly, another Terry Tunes mainstay. He takes a story from John Foster and Tom Morrison, with music by Phil Sheave, and this is another one shot from the Terry Tunes cartoon studio. And it's a wartime cartoon. A very unusual wartime cartoon, however, in that it centers on what will happen after the war is over, and how ridiculously futuristic everything will get. That is actually very unique. And yes, Bugs, a Terry tune was chosen over you. But you shouldn't fuss, however. It was last place. You'd understand that. And yeah, that would be all for this ceremony. Um, so I'm Man from Wackyland signing off, notifying all of you that was 1944.